they saw that the Slav areas to the east as primitive, even barbaric. I mean, those are the kind of words that he used to describe it. And therefore, it's a place where the Germans can come, can rule, can transform the area, can take over the resources. But you can't do that very easily in Western or Central Europe. Here is a great power system. Powers are seen by Germany as equals. But the Slav mass, there's this strange fantasy that somehow or other the Slavs are only fit to be ruled, and that the Germans are the best people to do it.
Yeah. So the war begins, the war proper. I mean, you point out that the war proper, the period from 1939 to 1945 is, only properly understood as sort of the climactic phase of a much longer story of war, for that matter. But the war starts, Barbarossa happens. Before that, the Germans have already, gobbled up Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. And it turns out to be short-lived for reasons we can get to. But for a while there, the Germans do have the start of something like an Eastern Empire. So as they seize it, as territory is growing under their control, how do they think about ruling it? How do they begin the actual implementation of a program of empire? What sources are they drawing on? How do they go about this business?
Yeah, that was a good question. I mean, the bizarre thing about the Second World War is that not just in the German case, but also in the Japanese case too, the strong sense that they've already won, that they can now build their empire, and it'll be a long-term empire. You've got the Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who's in charge of much of the program in the East, thinking that the Germans are going to rule this area for 500 years, and you're going to be 600 million Germans inhabiting it in the 500 years. Extraordinary fantasies that somehow the empire, now it's been conquered, will become a permanent feature. And so they begin to plan its organization politically. They begin to extract all the resources that they want, because they need them for the war as well. But the idea is that they'll go on, once the war's over, they'll extract these resources and the foodstuffs. The Slavs will become basically subject peoples, forced laborers, and so on. And above all, they will cleanse the area of all unwanted ethnic groups, of which the most obvious were the Jews. And then you will settle Germans in many of the areas. And these plans are put into operation. Not just the slaughter of the Jews, which does take place, of course, but they begin to move German settlers in. They want to transform the landscape. They want to build new towns. And all of this takes place in the space of 2 or 3 years, in the middle of the war. Looking back at it, it's simply deluded. But at the time, there was a strange confidence that perhaps they had actually done it. And had they defeated the Soviet Union or Stalin and sued for peace, then they might have become a permanent power across that part of Eurasia.
Talk about this notion of cauldron battle, and I suppose what I'm interested in is what is the experience of that kind of fighting like? Because it really is something on this scale and at this speed new under the sun. I mean, encirclement has been around for as long as there's been organized warfare. But what is cauldron battle? What's it like to be stuck in the pocket? What's the purpose of the exercise? How does this actually work?
That's a really, I think, important point, because it's hard for us to really visualize what this experience must be. But again, if you look at the Eastern Front and imagine we are talking, 1,000+ kilometers of distance, there's no way, and older maps misrepresented this. You would see a line north to south. Here's where the Germans are, and that is deceptive. Really what's going on, because you have to imagine this is also 1941, which is to say big swamps, large virgin forests that don't exist today. You just can't push forces through those. So what ultimately happens is the German advance is taking place on roads. The Germans push through on the borders. So for example, Army Group Center, they have 2 panzer groups. They push through with Hermann Hort in the north and Guderian in the south. And the idea is you drive to a point, in this case, Minsk, to link them up. They do actually enact a slightly smaller encirclement before that, but let's keep this simple. Now, we call that the Battle of Minsk, and that could suggest to people, well, it's all happening in this city called Minsk, the capital of Belarus today. But actually, it really should be termed the Battle of Belarus, because it's taking place on this country scale It's a republic of the Soviet Union, but today a country. When they finally link up, you end up with 300,000 Soviet prisoners of war. Again, that suggests something to us. Oh yeah, great German victory. It happens in 10 days. It's basically over in the latter part of June. What a great German success. But that's where you could be quite wrong if you just explored this battle from, again, operational strategic files, you would get that picture. It's a great German success. But then you have to do, and this is one of the things that I found so illuminating and did in all the books, including the Retreat from Moscow book, is I spent a lot of time looking for reading German letters, German diaries. You can get a very different perspective of the great German success, because ultimately what's happening is the forces that do the encirclement, the back half of that encirclement is the motorized and panzer groups. They close up behind the Soviets. What do the Soviets do? Command and control breaks down, and the natural inclination of forces that have been encircled, if they're even aware that they have been encircled, which isn't always the case for the Soviets, they don't always know what's going on, but most of them, and this will be the story of 1941, are trying to get out of the encirclement. They go east, they go south, they go north. They are breaking into these panzer groups, or these panzer divisions, motorized divisions, and they are a very thin veneer of this so-called cauldron. The extent to which it's hermetically sealed is a bit of a joke. And they suffer very real losses. And that's what I was talking about before. If people say to me, oh, where do they lose? But they're winning all the battles. What do you mean they lose men? Yes, overall, the German army doesn't lose very many men. If you just ask how many of the 3.2 million died in 1941, not that many. But if you look at where are they dying, their infantry elements, the motorized infantry that go along with the panzer divisions, there's not a lot of them. They are also specialized troops in a lot of ways. And they are day after day after day in combat. And so they definitely suffer losses. And it's not just the losses in terms of the combat, just the constant movement up and down the front on very bad roads. These are very, sandy roads. They often talk about driving in a cloud. Imagine what that does to your radiator, because they're 1930s designed air filters and things. It just gets into the engine. They try to flush it out with a lot of oil, but it doesn't work. And once you start losing mobility, you are also hamstrung in terms of your ability to respond to these waves of Soviets who are constantly trying to break out of your encirclements. So cauldron battles are, on the one hand, a great German mechanism for success, but incredibly frightening if you actually experienced one, especially if you're on the eastern edges of them.
And so talk a little bit more then about the German soldier of this moment.
I mean, this is a mass army. The only way you can raise that many men from a population base of about 80 million is to have a huge number of your youth in military service, which is another problem. I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but if you imagine that the German war effort requires obviously a lot of workers and you're fielding huge armies, this is part of the reason why this campaign absolutely needs to be what it was planned to be, a short campaign, because these men need to come back and go into the factories. Remember, there's a whole parallel war being fought against Great Britain, which requires completely different armaments, aircraft and U-boats and such things. So if this war continues, that's a real problem. So a lot of them are sort of 18 through to the late 20s. As to how ideological it is, that's become a real debate within my field of sort of German military history. The old debates used to be, is the Wehrmacht a criminal organization? Well, unambiguously, yes. But remember, if you go back even 30 years ago, no, the criminal organizations were the SS. Then there was the Wehrmacht. And of course, the German generals didn't know what was going on. Well, that's all been turned on its head by some wonderful historiography of the last 30 years. And so the question now becomes, well, how far down the pyramid does that filter? We know that, a lot of those men who would be 18 went to National Socialist schools, were in the Hitler Youth and so on, because they were young enough to have had a formative years being exposed to that. But again, not all of them. I mean, if you go to places like Berlin, that tended to be a hotbed of the sort of communists back in the day. Were they all converted? And I've done a few projects looking at German soldiers' letters. I did a book actually last year called Soldiers of Barbarossa, which just basically took, I think we looked at about 250 different guys and their various collections and tried to get a bit of a snapshot at who are these guys? What do they write about? And there is a lot of ideological terms being used. But again, how ideologically and how does that equate? Like with the thing we always think of is how criminal are they? Are they shooting? Are they on board with the mass murder of Soviet Jews, which is going to be a feature of Operation Barbarossa as well, not from the planning stages, but certainly by the early weeks. And there's evidence of that, but at the same time, there's a lot of letters. There's a guy who's done a study in Germany, and he would say about 1% talk about that. But the big caveat there is, if you were engaged in that, would you write your wife? Would you write your mother about what you've been up to in the East? You'd have to come from a very National Socialist family to do that, I think.
So, well, let's stick with this for a second. So there has been this sort of healthy corrective over the course of the last generation or so. I mean, you look at the, on one level, very good sort of World War II movies that come out in the 60s and the 70s. Germans are generally portrayed as, on the whole, pretty good chaps, on the other side, of course, but, their officers are basically trustworthy, sort of frustrated camp commandants and the like of the POW camps and the Great Escape and things like that. There's always a kind of sinister Gestapo character who comes in and sort of, is clearly a baddie, but the Germans are treated fairly respectfully. To what extent is the average German infantryman engaged in what we would understand to be atrocities, whether against the Jews or Russian civilians or however?
That's such a good question. So my take on a lot of that debate is we again, in the same way that I say if you understand we have to understand the benchmark for success. Well, to understand criminality, I think we have to have a sense of what are we talking about? And a lot of the works that engage with this will talk about the big touchstone events that we all know about. We know that Operation Barbarossa includes this Holocaust, so that's a natural area. And we know that there's an anti-partisan warfare, and therefore there's a lot of killing behind the front. But there's other parts to Operation Barbarossa which we really need to grapple with in order to try and determine this question of individual German soldier culpability for criminal activity. So one of the problems with Barbarossa operationally is it's not well resourced in terms of providing the men with food. The supply lines are overtaxed and they're basically spending their time trying to bring ammunition and fuel forward. So what does that leave for the average German soldier? Well, they have to live off the land. That's the terms that they use. And if you're living off the land in an extremely impoverished part of the world, that means as they come through in waves, basically. It's not all sort of north-south, the Germans just move through and then there's no more Germans. They're constantly coming through because, again, they're advancing on roads. They come into villages. The first wave often take what they need, but then there's going to be a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth wave. And as these men come through, and you can see it in their letters and diaries, they're like, oh, we walk into these villages and every time it's the same thing. They're throwing their hands up and crying, oh, we have no food, we have no food. But you only have to go through their little hovels a little bit because they always hide stuff. And of course, these people are doing that because they want something to live on through the winter. The men take what they need or what they want, sometimes a lot more than just what they need. They say, oh, it's going to be a great feast tonight. We got 3 chickens and we know where to find all these things. Now, the consequences of that behavior are very clear. There is mass hunger and starvation in the winter of 41-42. Now, to what extent would that class as criminal activity? I guess this is an individual question. Some people say, yeah, but the Germans had to eat too. Right. Yes, at the same time, they are an invading army and they don't just often take what they need, they take as much as they can possibly get. And there's a very clear consequence. And it's not just food as well. When they start getting into the colder months, they're taking clothes. They take farming implements. If they've got horses, well, we can use those to replace them. And these are impoverished people. They are taking the very means by which these people depend to survive. And so I kind of class this as secondary criminality because the act itself isn't intended to kill or necessarily even harm the person, but that will be the very real consequence. And you don't have to look too far into German letters before some of them have that sense. They have a very real sense of, well, these people, I wonder what they're going to do, or these people, they've nothing anymore. The infrastructure in the cities is also being removed. There's hospitals, of course, but they're closed off now to everyday people. Medicines aren't distributed. Again, the big organized factories, they lose most of the equipment that they need to function. So the consequences, the mass starvation, it's basically preordained, and it's caused by individual Germans. It isn't the Einsatzgruppe and the specialized group that are going out and shooting Jews, but you could say the average soldier had no association with that. This is the level at which the average German soldier very much does, and they themselves are doing it, not just consuming the food, but stealing it, stealing the clothes. And when it comes to the winter, they'll be the ones saying, well, look, it's pretty hard because this family is now being kicked out, but there's not enough room in this village anyway, and we need to ensure our own security, so they're going to have to go somewhere else.
And then, of course, when the winter comes, you document how once the Germans are in the defensive and oftentimes ceding ground to the Russians, the policy of, and you're going to pronounce this better than me, but of the Wüsten zone and creating a sort of desert space in the front of German lines is applied across the front. So here you're engaged in really acts of total warfare, right? You're burning villages, you're eliminating anything in the way of resources that Soviet soldiers might avail themselves of, or structures for observation. I mean, it's a flattening of the landscape, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think the interesting thing is a lot of people think of the sort of scorched earth policies as being something in the latter part of the war, but you're 100% right. That's happening already in 1941. It's happening with the Soviets when they're withdrawing, which is also part of the problem. They're also contributing to the destruction of the environment. But the Soviet scorched earth policies really pale by comparison, at least in 1941, by what the Wehrmacht will do in December, January 41, 42. They are much more thorough. And in some ways that's part of, maybe we get onto it, but it's part of the reason why I see the winter of 41, 42 as being perhaps different from some of the more, the older accounts. It's not necessarily the case, is what I argue in the book, that it's, we have this kind of narrative that it's all chaos and disaster for the Germans in the winter of 41, 42. Now, there are definitely elements of that, but that's got this sort of inflated notion in our head. The reality is somewhat different. And part of that coming to terms with the reality is it's not just the Germans who suffer that way. People will always say to me, yes, but the Soviets have better uniforms. But you imagine trying to live in the winter for a week. Just because you have a great winter uniform doesn't mean it's not freezing. It's not like the Soviet army don't suffer huge numbers of frostbite cases. Yes, the Germans have worse uniforms, no question. But typically they are, because they're on the defensive, they are inhabiting villages, or they try and occupy bunkers. They will move in the open when they are moving back to the next set of villages or the next bunker system, such as they're often occupying Soviet bunkers that had formerly been built. You can't really build in the winter because the ground is too frozen. But the Germans move from these occupied positions and they will destroy anything that they occupy. So as the Soviets move forward, there's a lot of Soviet soldiers who spend most of the winter literally in the open. Some units of the Soviets, even with better uniforms, have higher levels of frostbite.
The scale of the thing is so horrifying and mind-boggling. And I guess to your point about themes in the East, I mean, this is in general true of the East. The scale of things in the East is just vast in a way that it's hard for those of us like me who spend more time thinking about the war in Italy and France, for example, when it comes to World War II, to wrap my mind around it. I've been reading, I'm about 2/3 of the way through Vasily Grossman's Stalingrad. Obviously different part of the war in the East, but that's my best insight into the nature of the conflict and the scale of the maneuvers that are sort of described in that volume, not to mention your own books on the subject, and the envelopment tactics, occurring across, provincial distances, essentially. It's just stunning. You have a line in your book, it's the death toll, correct me if I get this wrong, the death toll in Leningrad is something, it's greater than the death toll of the British Empire in both world wars. Is that true?
That is correct. So if you add up British Empire war dead from both world wars, and you add up Soviet civilian and military casualties, both in Leningrad and in the various attempts to lift the siege, they lost more people in the 900-day or 870 days of the siege than the British Empire lost in both world wars. So in the Second World War, British casualties numbered about, I think, 385,000 total dead. In the First World War, of course, with the slaughter in Flanders, it was much greater. But one city on the Eastern Front accounted for more than all of that put together. The scale of killing and of slaughter on the East is just It just defies your thinking. There is a particular area of high ground to the southeast of Leningrad called the Sinyavino Heights. We call them the Sinyavino Heights. They're only the heights in the context of a generally very, very flat landscape. Living here in Scotland, I don't think they'd even get a name because, we tend to do hills rather bigger than that. And these heights were maybe, 4 or 5 miles from east to west and slightly less than that north to south. My estimate is that well over 500,000 Soviet soldiers died just in the attempts to take those heights at various points during the siege. Just unbelievable to think of the sheer carpet of corpses that must have been left there.
I want to come back to the question of human suffering here in a minute, but before we do, you've given us a good overview of the German concept for the siege. What was the Russian defensive concept? How did they start to organize themselves, and how did they end up defending against the besiegers?
Of course, the Red Army had extensive plans for how to defend itself against an attack. They fully expected at some point that there was a high risk of a German attack upon them. Their military doctrine, like so much of the military doctrine of the era, was built around the concept of offensive operations. It was generally believed through the 20s and 30s that the advent of mechanized warfare was, if you like, the antidote to the trench warfare of the First World War, that this was the way around it. Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of the great figures of the interwar years, came up with a concept of what he called deep battle, which was to engage the enemy through the full depth of their position, effectively extending over 100 kilometers of depth in order to break through comprehensively and to defeat them. And he envisaged the use of mechanized forces, airborne forces, air power, etc., in order to achieve this. But of course, if you're being attacked, the first thing is you have to soak up the enemy attack, bring it to a halt, and then you can launch your own counteroffensive. Will drive you into enemy territory. And in the case of the Red Army, there was an absolute expectation that as they advanced into German-held territory, the proletariat of those regions would rise up and would support them in overthrowing the fascist capitalist overlords, etc. They drew up extensive plans for how they were going to defend this, but the general feeling was that any German invasion would be halted some way short of Leningrad. The intention was to bring the German advance to a standstill somewhere in the Baltic states, and then, with mobilization complete, the Red Army would have sufficient numbers to be able to launch an unstoppable counteroffensive. There were problems with this, though. When the Baltic states were incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, on the one hand, it moved the frontier several hundred kilometers further to the west and therefore created this big buffer zone. But on the other hand, the old fortifications that had been built along the Russian frontier with Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania were now obsolete. So they were disarmed, and the guns and ammunition and other equipment from them was moved into the Baltic states in preparation for fortifying those areas. But those fortifications were in no way complete when the Germans attacked. And in any event, in almost every respect, Soviet military doctrine, much like the doctrine of most nations in the Second World War, proved to be completely inappropriate for the realities of mechanized warfare. You can make a very strong case for saying that it was the German flexibility due to the very high standard of its officers, of its staff system, and its culture of delegated decision-making, as much as its organizational ability to put panzer divisions in the field. It was doctrinal as well as equipment level that gave them this enormous advantage in the early years of the war. So the Red Army found itself falling back much, much further than it had ever expected. And it then ran into a very, very serious problem, which is largely around railroads. This is an era where, particularly in Eastern Europe, railways were still pretty much the only way of moving really substantial amounts of stuff around. The roads, particularly in northern Soviet Union, were not good. They still aren't particularly good even today, not least because for part of the year the weather is so awful and it'll destroy anything but very, very expensive tarmac roads. So when you have limited railway capacity and it's being constantly attacked and degraded by the enemy air power, you have competing demands upon that limited capacity. You can try to ship supplies to your armies to keep them alive, reinforcements, ammunition, replacement tanks, etc. You can use that railway capacity to move food and supplies into cities like Leningrad in anticipation of a siege, or you can use that railway capacity to evacuate civilians out of the path of the enemy. Now, to an extent, you can combine these things, and the trains running into the area, dumping supplies, can then pick up civilians on the way out. But nonetheless, there was not sufficient capacity to do all of these effectively. And the Soviets, understandably, decided that the priority was for keeping the Red Army as highly operational as possible, on the grounds that, well, if we get this right, the Red Army will stop the Germans sufficiently far from Leningrad that building up the city for a siege or evacuating the population will be unnecessary anyway, so we don't need to waste capacity on that. But the fact was that the Red Army had suffered such catastrophic losses in the opening weeks of the war, by the time it was driven back into the approaches around Leningrad, it really wasn't strong enough to hold back the Germans, and the Germans were thus able to surround a city that had not really been evacuated, hadn't really built up its supplies for a prolonged siege.
I'm really interested in your point about doctrinal failures on the Soviet side of things. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind saying more about that, and perhaps in the context of Soviet failure initially, more broadly. Obviously, there's a political dimension, Stalin's purges, things like that. There's the element of surprise itself. But you know, the way you characterize this concept of deep battle, the way you put it just now, you know, knowing nothing else about it, you could say, well, actually, in certain respects, the sort of blitzkrieg tactics that the Germans use are not, I mean, you could describe them as a kind of deep battle in a way. So what is it that's so wrong in their thinking that harms them?
I think it was more to do with the concept was fine. I think it was the manner in which they attempted to implement it was so inadequate for the trouble, for the problems that they faced. So like many air forces, for example, Soviet aviation was built around all sorts of misconceptions about how air power could be used. This concept of, if you like, heavy fighters that would proceed before bomber formations literally to sweep enemy air power from the sky so that the bombers could then move in without being attacked. The Germans, of course, tried this in the West in 1940 with disastrous consequences. And they had, you know, the German single-engine fighters were easily able to evade these initial German-Soviet fighter sweeps and then attack any bombers behind them. They had also inflicted crippling losses on Soviet aviation in the opening days of Barbarossa, destroying hundreds and hundreds of aircraft on the ground before they could get airborne. And you can't overlook the political side of this, the enormously damaging effect of Stalin's purges on the military. So many officers had been killed or imprisoned or demoted. So many others had been promoted way above their level of training or experience or expertise. And there was this enormous fear that if I do not execute the orders that have been given to me, literally down to the last letter, then I'm going to get arrested, I'm going to disappear, or, you know, if I'm lucky, I'll end up in Siberia, and if I'm not, I'll, you know, die against a wall somewhere. So during the run-up to the German invasion, for example, Soviet aviation commanders limited training missions, knowing that training flights with young recruits were much more likely to result in accidents, in crashes or whatever, because they had been told that unless it was categorically proved otherwise, any aircraft loss due to a training accident would be treated as sabotage, and the officers involved will be prosecuted for carrying out sabotage. So what's the solution to this? Well, you know what, we'll just do fewer training flights, because why carry the risk? So there was this slavish following of orders, even when you knew the orders were wrong. And this accounts very much for the massive casualties that the Red Army suffered in those opening phases, where they would slavishly attack a position which, you know, the orders are out of date by the time they reach the front line. And yet these guys just said, well, orders are orders. If we don't do it, we're going to get arrested, so we will do it anyway. There were also all sorts of problems with the equipment and the way that it was used, but this was also true in the West. So one thing, for example, people will say is that only a minority of Soviet tanks in 1941 had radios. And the intention was that it was only the tank commanders who would have radios. They would communicate with their subordinates by waving colored flags out of the turret. Of course, that didn't work, but people kind of forget that actually the British had thought about doing that in the 1932. So it wasn't such an outlandish idea. Soviet aviators, for example, often didn't have radios. They would be given their orders when they took off. And if they had radios, quite often it was only a receiver. So they could receive orders, but they could not communicate back with base or even with each other. So the purpose of the radio was purely to direct them in order to get them to do their superior officer required. The structure of the armed forces was something that evolved constantly as the war progressed. So many of the initial formations were very unwieldy and difficult to handle. The armor was often without adequate infantry support. The infantry often went into action without any adequate artillery or armored support. The reconnaissance was very disjointed. And when you find yourself in a war of survival, it's about the worst possible situation in which you have to put all of this right. And as I've said in other talks, the Red Army found itself in the position of somebody who is suddenly plunged into a fight where they're armed with a cudgel when everyone else is carrying swords. It's no good looking at the other guy's swords and thinking, damn, well, I wish we had got one of those before this fight started. You're just going to have to swing that cudgel and hope for the best. And yes, as the war progressed, the Red Army became better at swinging its cudgel. The cudgel itself became rather better than it had been originally. But in the end, compared to the way that the Germans fought, and particularly the way that the Americans and British fought, it was always going to be a cudgel. And the only solution was to bludgeon the Germans into defeat.